Let me see if I can get my desktop sharing here. I want to do a little AstroTech on the Raspberry Pi PICO. So the Raspberry Pi PICO, you've probably already heard of the Raspberry Pi. I actually did a AstroTech, a few months back on the Raspberry Pi itself. It's a small little desktop computer. And when this first came out, I thought it was just another Raspberry Pi, but it turns out it's not really a Raspberry Pi at all. It carries the name Raspberry Pi because that's the name of the company called Raspberry Pi. And so they call this one the PICO. And the key to this is they actually they developed a microcontroller called the RP2040. So the RP2040 is a microcontroller that the Raspberry Pi Foundation actually designed and had manufactured for them. And it's a very powerful little controller. And you can see the specs. I'm not going to read through the specs, but it does a lot. It's a very powerful little chip, and its cost is pretty low. So what they did is they then came out. They put that processor on a module, and it's called the Pi PICO, right? And it's a module, and the processor you can see. I think you can see my mouse, right? So you can see the processors on the board in the middle here, the black square. That's the actual processor. The rest of this is a module with the support pieces that go onto this. And you can see the pricing of it. This entire module is a $4 module. And then you can get some boards to kind of hook you up for $10, $10. And it's a microcontroller, so it can talk to lots of other things. I did a presentation once on the IoT, Internet of Things. So this doesn't have any Wi-Fi. This does not have any Bluetooth, but it's capable of talking to devices that have the Wi-Fi. So you can hook this up to your Wi-Fi if you want to. I've done that a few times with this little PICO board that lets you do that. It is out of stock often. I don't know if many people realize that the microchip market, the processors and the chips themselves, the market's pretty sparse right now. There's a huge demand. The pandemic reduced inventory, and while the demand went up, cars, right, electric cars or just regular cars, they can back themselves up. They have all sorts of cameras. Well, all that takes electronics to do that, right? The cars that we had in the 60s and 70s, the only electronics they had was a spark plug, right, and maybe a radio if you were lucky. But these days, there's a lot of electronics, and the car manufacturers are sucking up all the electronic parts. So things like this, they're having trouble getting them produced in the volumes that people are buying them. So I was able to buy some when there was some inventory, and I actually started checking real quick to see if there was inventory before the presentation. I couldn't find anybody that had stock. So if you keep an eye on it, though, you can be signaled for stock. So the processor of this itself is just a piece of hardware. And as we all know, you need software to run your hardware, right? A piece of hardware doesn't do a whole lot. And the PICO is the same. You can get a development kit for doing C and C++, but I can get that with a lot of other processors. This does some neat stuff, but nothing exciting. I can get Python if there's any Python coders. Python's a really nice programming language. It's a much higher level language than C or C++. And you can get MicroPython running on a RP2040 processor. So that module will run a version of Python. And again, I've played with it. It's very nice. It has some nice pieces. But the piece that I wanted to talk about was there's another piece of firmware that you can install called PicoMite. It was developed by this guy, Joff. That's his last name, actually, down here on his website, Geoff. He created MM Basic. It's a basic interpreter, like we used to run back in the 80s on your home computer. It just ran BASIC. And you can run BASIC these days on your home computer. But it's a very simple language. And the BASIC that's running on this, this PICO processor is very powerful. And just to give you a rough idea, it's I've got some specs in here. It's a full featured floating point 64-bit integer, 100,000 lines per second. So it runs pretty quick. Here's examples of some code. Here's a piece of code that I wrote real quick. That's the listing on my left-hand side here in the green, in the box, the dark box with the letters. I don't know you can read it. Don't worry about reading it, but it basically is the way you can compute pi itself. And then I ran the program. And if you see at the top, it says list. I listed out the program. Those familiar with BASIC know that's how you can see your code. And then I can run it. The real key to this is what I put down here in the corner. This is a PuTTY terminal. I do not take this code, compile it on my home computer, and then upload the compiled code and execute it on the PICO. If you've ever done any microcontroller work with like an Arduino or other versions, you compile it on one computer, upload the compiled code, the machine code to the processor, and then tell it to execute it. This is actually executing, and the interpreter is actually on the module. So I connect to the module with a terminal program. So I just plug in my USB from my home computer, where screenshots of my home computer, and I'm running the interpreter actually on the PICO itself. So when I say list, this is actually the interpreter running on the PICO, listing out the program. And when I say run, I'm actually on the PICO itself, telling it to run the code, and it'll execute the code for me, then come back to a prompt. So all of this can run from a terminal. And the nice thing is you don't have to have a terminal. You can put some code in there, unplug this thing, plug it back in, and it can automatically just run the code that you've written. So it's got a lot of power. PicoMite also has a really nice user manual. It's a 137-page extensive user manual, well written. It's currently at version 5. Just to give you a rough idea, we're actually at 5.7 beta 21, right? So this software, the MM interpreter, MM basic interpreter, has been around. I think I've used it for probably about 7 years now, maybe a little longer, 8 years. I started using, I think, around version 2. It ran on other processors. It was pretty good. It didn't knock my socks off, but once we got to this platform with this processor, it became very impressive. And all over those years, they've been writing the manual and keeping it current. So right now, as David Fields can tell you, he has a hard copy of it. And I saw in a video he showed me, it's well dog-eared, right? David's manual is, he's gone through it a whole bunch of times. Oh, was there questions? So the manual is a really good manual. And I would highly recommend, even if you don't get one of the processors, just take a peek at the manual if you'd like to do any programming. The really nice thing about this is it's all of that, plus it's free. The source code was released under the open source license, so you can actually download the source code to the firmware, the interpreter itself. So if you're curious on how how did they do that? How did they do a for loop? What does the code look like? It's written in C. It's using the SDK, but you can actually go get the source code. And I actually have worked with some of the developers and found some issues in the code when they were debugging some of the early beta versions. And I found the issues right in the code. I was actually able to look at the code, find the problem, and then I could just report back, this is what I see. And they agreed, and they made some changes, and a new version came out. So there's definitely a community of people and developers that are working on this to keep it current. And again, the source code is here. You can see it's at a kind of a funny UK Tailwind website in GitHub. But the website, if you want to take note, is called, it's the geoffg.net picomite.html. And that's where you can download the firmware itself that you just put on your PicoMite if you get one. Very easy to load it, actually extremely easy to load. And you can get the manual, and you can read up about projects and stuff that are on there. So it's a really nice processor if you like microcontrollers. I'm very into microcontrollers. I've done a lot with them, and I think I've gotten David Fields hooked. Can't say yet. He'll have to tell somebody else who will tell me whether he's actually hooked on it. But it's a very nice processor, very easy to use. So anybody have any questions on the PicoMite? I'm going to show just real quick because I have both of them.
A question from Karen, I believe.
Go ahead, Karen.
Hi. I'm really appreciating this PICO information. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a fun processor, and what I'm showing here is this is, I think it's still sharing. I'm live. This is the manual. You can see, I'm just going to sort of click through the manual here a little bit. It talks about hooking up an LCD panel. You can do touch panels. The functions, the list of functions down in here. Some of the math functions you can see. There's some advanced Fourier transformations and things like that are just built into the code itself to take advantage of. I've shown David, we've run some tests on the FFT capabilities, and it's extremely fast. It can look at the signals themselves. And over here on the side, you can see this is a window. This is my I'm running Linux, and I use PuTTY as my terminal program. But this is actually live right on a PICO. I have a PICO off to the side. I'm going to see if I can show on my camera, if you can see my camera. There's a PICO hooked up to a development board. And on the side of the board, there's that's a web interface. That's called an ESP01. It has an SD card, so I can plug files into it. And there's the PICO itself. And if I want to see what's on the actual card itself, the command is files, and it's showing me a listing. It's kind of like on a home computer, you'd say directory. And the command is called files. And here it is. This is my flash card. I have a bunch of different programs that I've put up there on my flash card. So I've been writing a bunch of different programs and doing a bunch of testing on it. But again, if you can see how fast this is, it's a very quick machine. Here's the editor. If I come into the editor to change my code, right, I can come in here and change the code. I can then escape out of here, and then I can run the code. This is going to just compute pi for me. Ironically, what I did is I went out on the web and I grabbed pi out to, I don't know, what is that, 15, 16 position, so that I could see that I was computing it correctly. I think one of these is actually, I told the system to just display pi as it knew it. And then I think the second one is me calculating pi using the floating point that it has. And it took about 4 milliseconds to calculate that pi out to, what are we looking at? 369 decimal positions. So, but again, it's a nice little unit. So, all right, that's what I had for tonight.
Thank you.
On the chat.
Want to read it, Rob? Don't see it.
Say again, I didn't understand it.
There's a question in the chat asking about how might you use the Raspberry Pi with ham radio?
Hang on, I'm going to see if I can find my chat. So this with ham radio, it has RS-232 capabilities. I haven't really spent a lot of time looking at this to find code. You certainly can write your own code, but because it's a microcontroller and I can talk to pins, I could key up a mic. I could also talk. I mean, I have an FTDX 3000 that has a USB interface. I could actually talk to that USB interface and change channels, key up the mic. Decoding things, I think could be done. It's fast enough, but I've never gone looking to see if somebody's already written it. So it's an interesting question, because back in the 80s and the 90s, you use your home computers to run all our ham radio stuff. But these days, a laptop is a lot more powerful than this. But it might make a very, very nice standalone, portable unit to give you computing power in the field. Does that answer the question?
Okay, I guess I thought it was a good answer, Rob. One thing you've got there in the PICO is 30 pins, general purpose pins. You can measure 30 things, including for ham radio, transmit power, battery voltage, solar power, if you solar power in the rig. You can control relays, transmit and receive relays, antenna relays. You basically have a system, and especially you had that for a long time with Arduino, a system you could program to do many things in a logical fashion, make measurements. But you got the PICO, something's faster, a lot more pins, fantastic capability for doing SPI interfaces and RTC interfaces. A GPS now, the GPS sensor costs $10, and you can interface that. An SD card reader, if you want to buy one, probably $5 gets you 10 of them from Amazon. That's the reader. So you can program for anything you want to do for a ham station. Functions. measurement decisions. Now, I wanted to do that sort of thing for a long time, but the languages I used were what is called high-level languages, the Fortran and BASIC, and I've written big codes in both of those. But I was not good at programming Arduinos, things like that, in C++ or PICO. What you have here with the PICO, and what Rob has just shown you with M and BASIC, is a way to use a high-level language on a tiny little computer that costs $4. And that's not anything you can do with your fanciest laptop, unless you somehow go and find a Fortran compiler or basic interpreter that runs it. $4 free software, the best manuals that I have seen, the best written manuals, they're free. That's a nice price. It's also a good entry into microprocessors. For something that's about 2.5 inches by about an inch. If you want to get the fancy little board that Rob showed you with all the lights and the SD card reader and a bunch of fancy little connectors, you have to pay big bucks. $10. $10 gets you that. So thought you can do. So and here he's showing you again some of those little things. So this is the heart of our TALSAT project. As it stands now, we're programming the Pi to do the mathematical and physics experiment functions for our satellite. And that will work with the physics experiments, meaning the antenna, the receiver, doing the calculations, meaning turning serial data, taking over a period of time into a radio frequency spectrum and then sending that back down. There's a lot you can do.
Okay. And a small little $4 part, right? I mean, it's a very powerful. I did find my chat finally. You had to find a window. The question was about a Raspberry Pi. So that's where you have to be a little careful. What I'm showing is actually called the PICO. It's made by the Raspberry Pi company, who originally made the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi itself runs Linux. And I think it can run a few other operating systems. But that is actually a small Linux computer itself that you have to hook up a monitor and a keyboard and things like that to use that. And there are examples of using a Raspberry Pi to do ham radio. What I was showing was actually called the PICO, the PICO, made by the Raspberry Pi company. So it's a little confusing, to be honest. It confused me when they first announced it. I was like, oh, okay, another Pi came out. But it's not. It's not at all the same thing. It's very different. The big difference here is that the company itself, the Raspberry Pi company, created this microcontroller. As opposed to a Raspberry Pi, the controller that's on it was made by a different company. Broadcom was the one that actually made that controller for the Raspberry Pi company. So the Raspberry Pi itself was so successful, they were able to make a lot of money. And so they built their own development team and developed their own processor for their own purposes. So that's what I was demoing, a little bit different than a Raspberry Pi.
So you connect your laptop to it. You make the laptop work as just a kind of a dumb terminal program. Start the little PICO going. And if you have a battery attached to it, which is not hard to do, then you unplug your computer and walk away.
Yeah, I think that's key there too. Is the PICO itself can run off of batteries for a long time because it's a very low power consumption. A Raspberry Pi, a Linux Raspberry Pi, will not run very long at all on battery unless you make it go to sleep most of the time because it's a huge consumer of power. So it'll deplete a battery quickly.
Okay, any other questions? Rob, thank you much. If you're still on.